Okay, so we've collected a sample. What we want ideally is what we call a representative sample. A representative sample is one in which the relevant characteristics of the sample members are generally the same as those of the population. The idea is we want our sample to mimic the population so that the values we get when we calculate things from the sample are good approximations of that population. So this is our goal when we collect a sample. We want a representative sample. Now, a statistical study suffers from bias if its design or conduct leads away from that, specifically if its design or conduct favors certain results. Now, there are several types of bias that can come up when you're involved in a statistical study. One is called sampling bias. This is a general bias when the sample is simply just not representative of the population. This can come up in many ways, but one way that it can come up is when you have volunteers answering your surveys. This would be called voluntary response bias. Voluntary response bias occurs when the sample is made up of volunteers. A good example would be online reviews. Online reviews are often voluntary. People choose to write them, and people will choose to write an online review if they're motivated to write an online review. And often they're motivated because they're really happy or they're really not happy. So you will tend to get extreme views instead of what you might call run-of-the-mill views. So extreme views, and often, even though you can have extreme views that are positive and extreme views that are negative, there is a slightly more likelihood that you'll get extreme negative reviews. Because again, we're talking about people who are volunteering to do something, and people are more likely, if they're angry, to write a review complaining than they are if they're happy. So you will tend to get bias when you have some kind of voluntary response survey. Another type of bias can come up in what's called a self-interest study. A self-interest study bias is bias that occurs when researchers have an interest in the outcome. So for instance, you might have a company that sponsors a study because they want to use the results of that study to market their product. So basically they sponsor the study to sell their product. So that would be in their self-interest. You can also have response bias. Response bias is when the responder gives inaccurate responses for any reason. A couple of types of reasons that might happen. There could be a perceived lack of anonymity in the survey. In other words, the responder, the person filling out the survey, fears or is embarrassed to answer honestly, so they end up answering dishonestly because they don't want to be perceived in a negative light by whoever is collecting the survey results. So this is because they are worried about how someone might feel about their responses. So that's perceived lack of anonymity. Another way that you might get response bias is with loaded questions. When the person puts together a loaded question to achieve a certain result. So that's when the question wording influences how somebody responds. And this one is not so much that the responder is trying to be dishonest, but the way the question is worded leads the responder toward a certain response. Okay, so these are two types of reasons that the responses might be inaccurate. Let's look at some examples of studies and kind of try to identify the type of bias that might be most likely involved, if any. So our first example, a study is financed by a major health supplement company on whether taking vitamin D helps improve your mood. So when we think about this, again, it's financed by this health supplement company. And you would think that the health supplement company would have a motivation for seeing something positive about vitamin D so they could increase their sales. So I would say that there might be self-interest bias happening here. But there may not be. The study may have been conducted in a very legitimate way with really good statistical ideals in mind. But anytime you have a study financed by a big company to try to sell their product, you want to consider that there might be some self-interest involved. Second example, to gauge public opinion on the support of a local school bond, a libertarian group asked homeowners if they, quote, support having property taxes increase. So notice how they're phrasing this. Instead of asking the people if they support increased funding for schools, they're asking, do you support having property taxes increased? So the way they're phrasing that would tend to lead people to say, no, I don't want to have to pay more. Whereas if you had phrased it in terms of supporting schools, there might have been a different result. So again, how you phrase a question can influence the result you get out of this. So this would be a loaded question that would lead to response bias. Number 3, a state Republican Party polls 200 of its members to determine whether its candidate for governor is likely to win against the Democratic candidate. All right, so one thing to note here is they're only polling their members. So they're only polling the people in their party. They're not polling or getting opinions of other people who would be taking part in the election. So I would say this would be sampling bias, because who they're choosing to poll is not representative of who might actually be voting in the election. These would be some people voting, but it would be a very distinct group that they are interviewing, not a more general group. So sampling bias because they're only interviewing Republicans. Our fourth example, a CNN website poll asked users if they think the defendant in a recent widely publicized murder trial is guilty. Notice this is an online poll, and generally website polls just ask for whoever happens to be there to respond. And so this would be a volunteer poll, and so you would tend to get a voluntary response bias. The people who are more likely to answer or respond to this poll would be people who feel strongly about that murder trial. All right, I've got 4 more examples. Take a moment, pause the video, and try working out yourself what type of bias you think would be involved in these 4. All right, so I paused for 10 seconds to hope that you yourself paused and have tried them out. So problem 5, the minister at a local church surveys her members as to the amount of their yearly charitable donations. All right, so you have a minister asking her church members a question about their charitable donations. Church members, if they haven't been donating, which is often what churches recommend, is that you donate to charities, they may be hesitant to say that. So I would say there's going to be some response bias from a lack of anonymity. Those church members may be worried about what the minister will think about them. Number 6, to determine dietary habits of college students, the student doing the research surveys students in their health class. So we want to know the dietary habits of college students in general, but the person is only going to look at students in their health class. Now, that's a very specific group of people. People who are taking a health class may be a little more conscious of what their diet is. And so you may tend to have a little bit biased results here, because what you sampled from is not representative of the population, the entire group of college students. So I would say there's some sampling bias here. Number 7, to determine the working status of full-time PCC students, the college randomly selects 200 full-time students to participate in a survey of how many hours they work weekly. Well, as I read through here, it's talking about the college randomly selecting 200 full-time students. Now, we wanted to know about full-time students. We randomly selected them, so we didn't choose by volunteering people or choose by picking out of a particular type of class. So I'd say that there's no obvious bias in this one. There may be if we got more information, but just on the surface here of what we have so far, there's no obvious bias that jumps out at me. Number 8, I look at a Yelp rating of a restaurant in a town that I'm visiting for a conference. Okay, a Yelp rating is a rating that is an online survey. So you would tend to have volunteers doing this rating, so you would tend to have voluntary response bias.